And also, you talked about the fact that the state of Israel is receiving $6.8 million per day as funding, and also the Palestinians are only receiving 0.3. With the Obama administration now cutting the funding for the 15 replacement helicopters, Marine Corps helicopters, because it's going to cost $15 billion to replace them. He's citing that. The question I have for you, I was looking through your website, and you also talked about $140 billion being given to Israel from, I think, the late 90s all the way up to 2003, and $118 billion being given in 2007. Why isn't the U.S. administration at this time also looking into cutting the funding for the State of Israel? Because the State of Israel, a gross national product, is close to what it is in South Korea. So why aren't they cutting off funding to a nation that can stand on its own 2 feet?
That's the key question, and it's a very, very significant question, especially as you say, right now when things are especially so difficult here in the U.S. I'm sure they are in Canada too, but certainly here people are losing their jobs in large numbers. People are losing homes. Schools, I just talked to a young woman who just graduated from a very good college and wants to be a teacher, and it turns out that teachers are being cut back, that teachers are being laid off, so there are going to be larger class sizes for American students. So while everything can be looked at as something to cut, the money to Israel is sort of sacrosanct. It's never discussed. Many of us are hoping to change that. I think we are going to change that. But what happens is the Israel lobby is so powerful in this country, and this is something, like most people, I knew nothing about 8 years ago. But now that I've researched it, I am astounded at the power of a very tiny number of people in the United States. And also Canada has this is going on there too. But in the U.S., this very powerful lobby, it's the American Israel Public Affairs Committee is one aspect of it. It's also the so-called Anti-Defamation League is part of it. There are JCRCs in every community that are basically advocates for Israel. On almost every campus in the U.S., there's an organization called Hillel, which truthfully often also is another advocate for Israel on the campus. So a president of the United States is afraid to talk about anything negative about Israel. Congress people are afraid to suggest that we consider cutting back this massive and really unconscionable, irrational funding to one of the nations, one of the richest nations on the planet, a nation that consistently uses U.S. money in ways that are in violations of U.S. law, as well as in violation of international law. And yet everyone, almost, is fearful to discuss that, because if they do, a number of consequences will happen to them. One is that the media, which are very Israeli-centric, will in many cases start to attack them, spinning the stories in ways that would be very unfactual, but would impact them negatively, and perhaps fool a lot of people who are, who don't know actually what's going on because they don't have the time that I've devoted to researching it. So they would be attacked by the media. They would also have these numerous political action committees that have been formed on behalf of Israel would funnel massive amounts of money into someone to run against them in the next election. So you would have a political action committee, a PAC, for example, with a name that might be something like Northern Californians for Good Government. What that actually is people advocating for Israel. But they give their committees fraudulent, deceptive names, but they use their money to advocate for Israel. So a candidate realizes that if they say something about Israel that these very fanatically devoted partisans of Israel dislike, then it is quite likely that they'll be targeted with a campaign intended to push them out of office. That, they could be in Wyoming or South Dakota or somewhere, and lots of out-of-state money would come from New York and Los Angeles and around the country that would come into their opponent. With that, massive amount of money, the opponent could put on the most effective television ads that money can buy, probably would not even talk about Israel-Palestine, might talk about ranching issues or agriculture or the environment or business or in today's economy, something to do with the financial conditions. And people would think, oh, that sounds like a good candidate. I'll vote for him. Because there would be these very effective advertising campaigns. And the voters would have no idea that what had really just happened is that a man or a woman representing them in good conscience, keeping American interests in mind and American principles in mind, had just been defeated by a tiny but well-focused, well-funded special interest lobby. That's what's going on.
And also, the last question I have for you, we're going to have to keep it really brief, the answer, because you only have about 2 minutes left. I have to go over to the next guest. We had a guest on January 19th, Eva Bartlett. And what happened is that Eva was talking about there's a new weapon that Israel came out with called the dime. And dime basically causes severe burns to anyone that comes in contact with this, right to the bone. What involvement did Lockheed Martin and other American war-producing companies might have had with the production of this weapon, and also how much would the U.S. government have funded with this weapon?
I don't know. Sadly, I don't have the research. I don't know about any the weapons, the companies that might have produced that weapon or researched on it. So I can't give you that answer. I know that a great deal has come out about the use of phosphorus by Israel, which is under certain conditions, and they seem to have violated these conditions. It's a war crime to use that. It's a really, really dreadful weapon and what it does to human beings, and therefore it's banned for use in the ways Israel just used it. And as I recall, it came out that was some of that weaponry was being built in a small town in the middle of the country. I think it was in Arkansas or someplace like that. The people who were in those factories, when they were told what was going on, were actually shocked to learn it, had no idea, and were appalled and didn't want to be part of it, but they had no idea about it. So I do know, when I was in Gaza a few years ago, that there was evidence that Israel was using a number of very strange, extremely cruel weapons against civilians. There was a gas that had been used that I don't think anyone still knows really what it contained, but I saw people in hospitals just writhing in agony from this gas that had been, had blanketed homes and that type of thing, and were having convulsions and things. So there are a number of cases of Israeli weaponry that is illegal to be used against civilians, cluster bombs, for example, in Lebanon and other places. There's a pattern of using these ruthless, extremely cruel, often illegal or sometimes new, so they're not yet illegal, weaponry against the Palestinians. And in many cases, the U.S. military aid has funded that. Sometimes it's U.S. companies. Sometimes U.S. military aid is actually used by Israel to fund their own competing weapons industry. So, sometimes the weaponry is created by the U.S., sometimes it's created by Israeli companies. But in almost all cases, it's U.S. tax money that's funding those weapons. And most U.S. citizens, if they knew that, would be appalled and would object to it, but we're not learning about it from our media.
And quickly, before I take a break and go on to the next guest, could you leave our listening audience with some contact information just in case they want to contact you and ask you some questions we didn't cover today? And also your website there, Alison?
Yes, that would be great. Our website is ifamericans.org. That's ifamericans.org. And our phone number, our office number, is 202-631-4060. I'm actually traveling right now, so you wouldn't reach me on that phone number. But if you go to our website, there's also an email address there, contact@ifamericans.org, that I would see within the next day or two. So I hope people will go visit our website. We have a lot of information there, and I hope that listeners will tell other people about it as well.
Yeah, we'll definitely have to get you back on in the future. There's so much information that you just can't handle all the information on your website, even in an hour show. But we'll get you back on in the future there, Alison. And thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for inviting me to be on it.
You're welcome. This is COOP Radio 102.7 FM, CFRO. You're listening to the Monday Brown Bagger. We're going to take a quick break, and then we will come back with Gemini.